A Navy SEAL sits behind a table at a bookstore in Virginia Beach. Cameras flashing, fans lined up past the front door. He signs copies of a memoir about a mission that made headlines worldwide. 300 miles west, outside Fort Bragg, a retired Delta Force operator pulls into his driveway. There is no name on the mailbox, no photographs on the walls, no books on the shelf about what he did in Mogadishu or Fallujah or a dozen other places that still carry classification stamps. Most people assume the Pentagon gagged Delta Force, that military lawyers locked these operators into silence with classified contracts and federal prosecution threats. Most people are wrong. The real reason Delta operators refuse to write memoirs has nothing to do with the law. And there is one operator who did write a book, one man in 50 years of unit history. His name is coming at the end. But to understand why he is the exception, you need to understand the culture he broke. Start with the other side of the special operations world. Start with the SEALs. Marcus Luttrell published Lone Survivor in 2007, and that book changed the economics of military publishing overnight. A former Navy SEAL telling a first-hand combat story from the mountains of Kunar Province in Afghanistan sold millions of copies and became a feature film starring Mark Wahlberg. The publishing industry took notice. Editors at major houses in New York started making phone calls to naval special warfare veterans, asking who else had a story worth printing. Chris Kyle answered that call with American Sniper in 2012. The book spent weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and eventually sold over 1 million copies in hardcover alone. The Clint Eastwood film adaptation grossed over $500 million at the global box office. Kyle became the most recognized military figure in America since Audie Murphy, a face on magazine covers, a guest on every talk show, a name that civilians who had never met a veteran could identify on sight. Robert O'Neill followed in 2014, publicly claiming to be the operator who killed Osama bin Laden inside the Abbottabad compound during the Neptune Spear raid. O'Neill went on Fox News for a 2-part special, launched a national speaking tour, and built a personal brand around one trigger pull inside a dark Pakistani bedroom. These 3 men were not isolated cases. They were the tip of a publishing wave that rewrote the economics of special operations retirement. Former SEAL operators started launching consulting firms, motivational speaking companies, podcast networks, fitness brands, and leadership development seminars. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the Tier 1 element of the SEAL community, became the most publicly visible special operations unit on the planet. Publishing houses offered advances north of $1 million for the right story. Speaking fees climbed past $50,000 per appearance, and the top names were booking 30 or 40 events per year. The Warrior memoir became its own literary category, with its own shelf at Barnes & Noble, and the SEALs owned every inch of it. Now, walk across the hall inside Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters at Fort Bragg. Walk into the world of 1st Special Forces, Operational Detachment Delta. Same wars. Same target buildings in Iraq. Same helicopter rides into compounds in Afghanistan. Same level of operational tempo. The same cost in blood and marriages and sleepless years. But a completely different relationship with the American public. Delta Force operators do not write memoirs. They do not appear on cable news. They do not launch personal brands or pose for magazine covers. They do not give keynote speeches at corporate leadership retreats in Las Vegas ballrooms. When they retire, most of them disappear into contracting work overseas, small businesses in rural North Carolina, or quiet federal consulting positions where nobody in the office knows what they did for 2 decades. Their resumes carry gaps that no hiring manager questions, because the gaps belong to the Department of Defense, and the stories stay locked inside the operator's memory. This culture was not an accident. Colonel Charlie Beckwith built it deliberately when he stood the unit up at Fort Bragg in 1977. Beckwith had spent time embedded with the British Special Air Service at their headquarters in Hereford, England, and one of the things he imported from the SAS was the idea that silence is not a policy. Silence is a personality trait. You do not talk about missions, because talking means you have confused the mission with yourself. The work is the point. Your name is irrelevant. That philosophy embedded itself into the selection process, into the operator's training course, and into the social fabric of every squadron. Operators who survived the land navigation courses in the mountains of West Virginia and earned a spot in the unit entered a community where visibility was treated as a character defect. If someone from the unit appeared on television, gave an interview to a reporter, or hinted at operational details at a dinner party, The community response was not a letter from a Pentagon lawyer. The response was social exile. Other operators stopped calling. Invitations to unit reunions dried up. And the message carried itself without anyone writing it down. If you talk, you were never really one of us. And that message held weight because the men inside the Combat Applications Group valued membership in that community above anything else in their professional lives. The unit was family, tribe, and identity compressed into one compound at Bragg. Losing standing inside that compound meant losing something that a book advance, no matter how large, could never replace. Even after retirement, the discipline held. Former Delta operators at neighborhood barbecues in Fayetteville told neighbors they worked in military logistics or communications. Their wives learned to deflect questions about overseas deployments. Their children grew up knowing that their father had done something important, but never knowing exactly what. The cover story became a second skin, worn so long that shedding it in a memoir felt less like honesty and more like undressing in public. Now, here is where most people get the story wrong, and this is the part that reframes everything you just heard. The assumption across internet forums and military discussion boards is that Delta operators are legally prevented from writing books. People believe the Pentagon classified every mission the unit ever ran and that operators would face federal prosecution if they put a single page to print. That is not how it works. The Department of Defense runs a pre-publication review process through the Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review at the Pentagon. Every former military and intelligence community member who wants to publish a book, an article, a screenplay, or even a detailed social media post about classified operations must submit the material for review. The office checks for classified information and redacts anything that would compromise sources, methods, or ongoing operations. This process applies equally to former Navy SEALs, former Delta operators, former CIA officers, former Green Berets, and former Marine Raiders. The legal framework is identical across every branch and every unit under the Joint Special Operations Command umbrella. Marcus Luttrell submitted Lone Survivor through pre-publication review. Robert O'Neill went through the same process before his Fox News appearance. Chris Kyle submitted American Sniper and received clearance after redactions. The system reviewed those manuscripts, pulled the classified material, and cleared the rest for public consumption. The system did not stop SEALs from telling their stories. And technically, the same system would not stop a Delta Force operator from writing his. The silence inside the Combat Applications Group is not enforced by Pentagon attorneys or classification stamps. It is enforced by peer pressure, by unit culture, and by a shared belief that operators who seek attention have missed the point of the profession. That distinction changes everything about how you understand both communities. One community treats silence as optional. The other treats it as sacred. If you have watched this far, you already know this channel covers Tier 1 special operations the way most channels will not. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. New videos drop every week. So what does the silence actually cost a retired Delta operator? Consider the economics. A best-selling military memoir, like American Sniper, generated an advance reportedly north of $1 million for Chris Kyle before the book even hit shelves. The film rights added millions more. Speaking fees for former SEAL authors with name recognition range from $20,000 to $75,000 per event, and the top names book 30 to 50 events a year. Robert O'Neill reportedly earns mid-six figures annually from his speaking and media appearances alone, years after leaving active service. Now picture a retired Delta Sergeant Major sitting at a kitchen table in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He has 20 years of combat deployments behind him. He carried a rifle through the streets of Mogadishu in 1993. He kicked in doors in Fallujah in 2004. He ran killer capture missions across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border for years that blurred together. A Medal of Honor nomination packet with his name on it gathers dust in a Pentagon filing cabinet. His story, if told honestly, would sell 1 million copies. He does not write the book. He does not take the speaking fee. He does not build the brand. He takes a quiet government consulting job, coaches his kid's baseball team in a small town, and the stories stay inside his head until the day he is buried at a military cemetery with a flag folded over his casket. The financial gap between a visible SEAL veteran and an invisible Delta veteran can reach 7 figures across a decade of post-service life. That is not a trivial sacrifice. That is a house, a college fund, a retirement cushion, all traded for a principal that will never appear on a bank statement. Meanwhile, the military speaking circuit in cities like Dallas, Tampa, and Washington keeps growing every year, and the men filling those stages are almost exclusively former SEALs. The audience assumes that if Delta operators had stories worth telling, they would be up there too. The audience has no idea how many stories are sitting in living rooms in North Carolina, untold. And the cost goes beyond money. Delta operators also forfeit any public acknowledgement of their service. When a former SEAL walks into a restaurant and someone recognizes him from a book jacket or a television interview, that man receives a form of social validation that most combat veterans never experience. Delta operators get nothing. Their neighbors do not know what they did. Their children's teachers have no idea. The barista at the coffee shop in Fayetteville does not realize that the quiet man ordering black coffee walked through the same doors as some of the most significant raids in American military history. But before you conclude that the SEAL approach is obviously the smarter path, look at what visibility has cost the men who chose it. Robert O'Neill faced immediate and sustained backlash from within the naval special warfare community after his Fox News interview. Fellow SEAL operators, including members of the Abbottabad raid team, publicly disputed portions of his account and accused him of violating the unwritten code that once existed inside Dev Group. The Naval Special Warfare Command sent a formal letter to active and retired SEALs, reminding them that details of special operations should not be discussed in public. Chris Kyle faced a defamation lawsuit from former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura over claims Kyle made in American Sniper about a bar fight at a SEAL gathering. The lawsuit continued after Kyle was killed at a Texas shooting range in 2013, and a jury in Minnesota awarded Ventura nearly $2 million in damages against Kyle's estate. The legal battle dragged Kyle's widow, Taya Kyle, through years of depositions, courtroom hearings, and tabloid scrutiny while she was still grieving. Matt Bissonette, the former Dev Group operator who published No Easy Day in 2012 under a pen name, faced a Department of Defense criminal investigation for releasing his account of the bin Laden raid without completing the required pre-publication review. Bissonette ultimately forfeited over $6 million in book proceeds and speaking fees as part of a federal settlement. $6 million gone because he skipped the paperwork. And beyond the lawsuits and financial penalties, a harder cost lingers over the SEAL memoir wave. Some senior figures inside the special operations community have argued that the published details exposed tactical information, safe house procedures, entry techniques, and targeting methods that adversaries could study. Those descriptions of room-clearing tactics, communication protocols, and intelligence-gathering patterns became available to anyone on the planet with $20 and an Amazon account. The SEAL community gained fame, but it also handed a reading list to its enemies. Now, the open loop from the beginning of this video. One Delta Force operator did write a book. His name is Eric Haney. He published Inside Delta Force in 2002, the only first-hand memoir by a Delta operator in the unit's entire 50-year history. Haney was an original member of the unit, one of the soldiers selected during the very first Delta Force recruitment cycle under Colonel Charlie Beckwith in the late 1970s. He served through the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt at Desert One in 1980, through multiple overseas deployments in Central America and the Middle East during the 1980s, before eventually retiring from the Army. The book sold well and attracted Hollywood attention. It became the basis for the CBS television series The Unit, which Haney co-created with playwright David Mamet. The show ran for 4 seasons on network television and introduced millions of Americans to a fictionalized version of Delta Force culture. But the response from inside the real unit was immediate and brutal, in the way that only a closed community can manage. Former operators distanced themselves from Haney, both publicly and privately. Members of the unit questioned the accuracy of specific stories in the book and suggested that Haney had dramatized or fabricated certain episodes. Some former operators went further, telling journalists and military podcasters that Haney had exaggerated his own role in events and included conversations that never happened the way he described them. Nobody filed a lawsuit. Nobody called the Pentagon Inspector General. They did something that, inside that culture, carried more weight than any courtroom ruling. They stopped claiming him as one of their own. At reunions and informal gatherings among retired operators, Haney's name became a cautionary verb rather than a proper noun. Eric Haney became the cautionary tale that reinforced the very rule he broke. In 50 years of operational history, one operator wrote one book, and the unit treated him like a man who had betrayed a family oath. That ratio tells you everything about how deep the code runs. This is not a regulation that a military attorney drafted inside a Pentagon office. This is a belief system that operators carry in their bones, a conviction that the mission speaks for itself and the man who carried the rifle stays in the shadows. The SEAL model and the Delta model represent two competing answers to the same question. What does a Tier 1 operator owe the public after he takes off the plate carrier for the last time? SEALs say the story belongs to the man who survived it, and he has every right to tell it on his own terms. Delta says the story belongs to the unit, and the unit does not talk. Neither side is entirely wrong. Both carry costs that the other side does not pay. The SEALs gained influence, income, and a permanent seat in American popular culture, but they cracked open the door to lawsuits, operational exposure, and a fracture inside their own community that has never fully healed. Delta preserved its culture and its operational security, but its operators walk through retirement without a single dollar of public recognition for missions that shaped the entire post-September 11 world. 50 years. Thousands of operators. Hundreds of combat deployments across every theater the United States has fought in since 1980. And one book. That is not a legal restriction. That is a tribe that decided, collectively and permanently, that silence is the price of admission. And every man who wore the unit patch agreed to pay it. Whether that code represents admirable discipline or an outdated tradition that denies brave men the recognition they earned is a question worth arguing about in the comments below. YouTube thinks you will like this video right here. Click it. And if you have watched this far, hit subscribe. More Tier 1 stories are coming every week.